This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history, including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 24, The Lynching of Stephen before Saul of Tarsus. After Vitellius' departure for Antioch, the sect of the Nazorean was attracting more and more supporters, including even some priests. Additionally, Greek-speaking Jews, as well as native speakers, were joining the cause. As mentioned in an earlier episode, prior to being put to death, Jesus had gathered around himself 12 men meant to symbolize prophetically the end-times gathering of the 12 tribes of Israel, hearkening back to the earliest days of the patriarchs, the Exodus, and the conquest of the Promised Land, whose stories were in the first of the books of Moses, which is referred to today as Genesis. There was a hope among the Jewish people that on the last day, God would gather those tribes who had been scattered centuries earlier. Jesus had invoked the end times by gathering 12 men around him, ready to usher in a new era, a new kingdom where God would reign supreme. Jesus had given these 12 a mission to begin the gathering of God's people. He sent them, which is why these 12 were also known as apostles, which means one who sent. Jesus said that God himself would complete the work that the 12 had started. These 12 were also to be part of ruling God's people at the end times, sitting on 12 thrones. Of course, one of the 12 had betrayed Jesus, handing him over to his ultimate death. But the others were now leading the growing community, and they did not want to be encumbered by the material needs of those who were coming to join their ranks. The members of this sect of the Nazorean believed in radical sharing, including the new members, both Greek-speaking Jews as well as native speakers. There were many people coming to the apostles with proceeds from sales of property or simply sharing their material wealth. One example was a certain Joseph, who earned the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. But some of the Greek-speaking members felt that they were being neglected in the daily distribution. It might have seemed strange, but distributing money and determining the material needs of multilingual groups was a time-consuming and challenging role. The apostles wanted to focus their efforts on prayer, reading their sacred texts, and recalling their memories of Jesus, what he said and did while he was with them. So, to deal with the influx of new members, the daily distribution, and the concurrent challenges of different language groups, they appointed 7 Greek-speaking men to minister, or in Greek, diakonein, and that's how they became to be known as deacons. These 7 were Stephen, who was a gifted speaker, Philip, who was the father of 4 unmarried daughters who were known for prophesying, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas of Antioch, who himself was a convert to Judaism. Later, these 7 would be known as the first deacons of the church. It was an example of how in the early days, when the leaders saw a need, they felt comfortable adapting the structure to meet that need. Though he'd been appointed to assist with the daily distribution, the eloquent and compelling speaker, Stephen, attracted audiences with his oratory. But now, since Pilate had been removed as procurator, there was something of a power vacuum of strong Roman leadership in Judea. The people could effectively take matters into their own hands, or so they thought. Roman-occupied territory came with certain immutable rules and laws, one of which was regarding capital punishment. Nobody was allowed to put anyone else to death without Roman approval. Romans found this to be an effective way to maintain order and suppress factionalism. But Pilate's absence provided an opening for Stephen's opponents, those from the Synagogue of Freedmen in Jerusalem. This Synagogue of Freedmen in Jerusalem had been founded by a community of Jews from Italy who returned to the land of their ancestors and established their own synagogue. It happened that Jewish slaves had been taken to Rome from various conquests, including the Maccabean Revolt more than a century earlier. These slaves were settled in Rome, but across the Tiber. And today, that area of Rome is known as Trastevere, which means across the Tiber. Eventually, the descendants of these Jewish slaves were considered emancipated Roman citizens, and they returned to Jerusalem to found their own synagogue, known as the Synagogue of Freedmen. By 37 CE, the synagogue had grown to include those from Cyrene, Alexandria, Cilicia, and Asia. Members of this synagogue came forward to debate Stephen, who was claiming that Jesus was the Messiah, the anointed one sent by God. The debates continued, and eventually some of those from the Synagogue of Freedmen made allegations against Stephen, that he was speaking against Moses and against God. The crowds were incited based on these accusations, and they grabbed Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin, overseen by the recently installed high priest Jonathan. Jonathan had certain sympathies for the followers of this new way, and his relative, Johanan, was instrumental in that. Those who had made these allegations now pressed their case before the religious leaders. They said that Stephen, quote, never stopped saying things against this sacred place and the law. We have heard him claim that this Jesus, the Nazorean, will destroy this place and change the customs that Moses handed down to us, end quote. At this point, all eyes turned to the new high priest, who asked incredulously, "Is this true?" At that, Stephen began preaching about Jesus, and how he was the anointed one, the Messiah, sent by God, and how God does not dwell in human-made homes, that is, the temple. As he spoke, the people became even more enraged. Jonathan, the high priest, was losing control of the situation. This was too much. Stephen's ideas were heard as an offense against God and the temple, and that was considered blasphemy according to the law of Moses, and blasphemy was a capital offense, worthy of death. In a fury of rage, the crowd dragged Stephen outside the city and began to stone him. The high priest seemed powerless to stop the mayhem. Before long, the entire crowd had followed the lead, throwing stones at Stephen in righteous anger to defend the one God and the temple against Stephen's affront of both. In a matter of minutes, Stephen was bloodied, broken, bruised, and dead. The people quickly scattered, but Saul, one of the religious leaders, looked on approvingly. Saul was a Jewish man of the tribe of Benjamin. He was in his late 20s, having been born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but raised in Jerusalem. He was a skenopoios by trade, which can mean tent maker, but also one who works with any type of leather. His sister also lived in Jerusalem, and she had a son who was close to Saul in his early years. Saul was his Jewish name, but he went by Paul when he was engaged with those of the Greco-Roman world. Tarsus of Cilicia was an important regional city. From the time of Mark Antony, who met Cleopatra for the first time in Tarsus, the city had been granted the status of a municipium, that is, it was free and exempt from taxation. This also meant that most of its residents were granted Roman citizenship, something that had been confirmed by Augustus. And as an aside, the Stoic philosopher Athenodorus, tutor of Augustus, was also from Tarsus. That Saul was a skenopoios, a tent maker or leather worker, meant that he worked with hides, and hides, leather, needed to be treated. In antiquity, the way to treat leather was with uric acid, derived from urine, whether human or animal, as part of the process to soften hides and remove hair. Urine contains ammonia, which acts as a cleaning and dehairing agent. Tanners were associated with strong odors because they worked with substances like urine, animal fats, and other organic materials that were used during curing and tanning. This reputation made tanning a low-status and unpleasant occupation. As a tent maker, a skenopoios, Saul was likely close to many foul-smelling materials. In addition to his profession, he also studied Mosaic law and was now a Pharisee, which meant that he was motivated by a zeal for God and to live according to God's law as revealed and written down by Moses. Saul was filled with confidence in his own knowledge and understanding. He and all those who participated in Stephen's demise felt fully justified in their actions, as it says in the law of Moses that one who blasphemes shall be brought outside the city and stoned to death. And for the Romans, Jesus was crucified because, as Quintilian the orator said, whenever we crucify criminals, we place them where the greatest number of people can watch and be influenced by this threat. For every penalty is aimed not so much at the offense as at its exemplary value. Saul felt justified in his methods, as those who followed the new way were proclaiming Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. From Saul's point of view, that could not be the case, for the law of Moses stated clearly that one who hangs from a tree is cursed by God. That's precisely why the religious authorities advocated crucifixion, for that was a public execution of one, quote, hanged on a tree. When the people saw that Jesus, who they had claimed to be the Messiah, was actually cursed by God, this religious aberration would be over. Instead, as Saul could see, there were still many advocates and devotees of this new sect. Not content with the stoning itself, the crowds under the leadership of Saul began rooting out the followers of this new way. Saul went house to house in Jerusalem and handed over those members he found to the religious authorities. The pressure was so great that many of the sect of the Nazorean fled Jerusalem altogether, scattering to parts of Judea and Samaria, but also going as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch in Syria. Some of those who went to Antioch included Lucius of Cyrene, Simeon, Niger, and Nicholas, an Antiochene convert to Judaism who had been appointed to help with the daily distribution. But the apostles stayed in Jerusalem, though they were in hiding. For the Jewish feast of Pentecost, Vitellius, Roman governor of Syria, returned to Jerusalem again, as it was good to be there for the major feasts. He had already decided to depose Jonathan as high priest, and instead appoint his brother Theophilus. The fact that there had been a stoning was completely unacceptable. Only the Romans were to put people to death. Jonathan would have to go. And for his part, Johanan took to writing down some of the stories he remembered about Jesus. Next time, we'll see that Saul experiences a revelation that he considers to be from God, whereas Caligula suffers from a serious illness.